Hi, I'm Dr. Mike McInnes. I'm one of the chief educators of Doctors in Training, and I want to welcome you to this first of 3 solid anatomy lectures on the abdominal organs. Now, if you've watched some of the videos on the thorax, you might recall that we are coelomates. For the first few weeks of development, we have a mostly hollow center called a coelomic cavity. And this space becomes divided up into separate cavities that the lungs and the heart and the abdominal viscera grow into and fill. So in these videos, we're going to cover the abdominal cavity and the viscera found within it. So let's start with a brief overview of the embryological development of the abdominal cavity before I turn it over to Dr. Phelan to discuss the organs themselves. So at the end of the 4th week of development, when the process referred to as folding is complete, the embryo has a single central body cavity, that coelomic cavity, which is partially divided into a superior thoracic cavity and an inferior abdominal cavity by the septum transversum. So the septum transversum extends transversely from the anterior body wall inferior to the base of the developing heart. Now, within the coelomic cavity, you have the primitive gut tube, which runs from the mouth to the anus, and then this tube is suspended by the dorsal and ventral mesenteries that extend sagittally from the midline of their respective walls. Now, these mesenteries are double-layered extensions of the serous membrane that lines the coelomic cavity. The part of the serous membrane that lines the portion of the coelomic cavity that becomes the abdominal cavity is called the peritoneum. At about the 5th week of the development, pleuroperitoneal folds begin extending transversely from the lateral walls of the embryo, and then about the 7th week they fuse with the septum transversum and the mesentery of the gut tube at the level of the esophagus to completely separate the pleural cavity from the peritoneal cavity. Then muscle grows peripherally from the body wall across this transverse structure to form the diaphragm. Now, as development proceeds, the gut tube lengthens and it differentiates into different parts of the digestive tract like the stomach and the small intestine. And the gut also gives rise to the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas, all of which bud from the superior part of the gut tube, which is called the foregut. Now, the spleen does not bud from the gut tube, but it develops independently within the dorsal mesentery, dorsal to the gut tube. Early in the development, all the digestive tract and the organs that develop from it and the spleen are all located between these 2 layers of peritoneum forming mesenteries, and they're classified as intraperitoneal structures because they are covered on all sides by peritoneum. Blood vessels and lymphatics and nerves run from their origins on the posterior abdominal wall between these layers of peritoneum, forming the mesenteries that supply the intraperitoneal viscera. Now, the ventral mesentery initially connects the foregut to the anterior wall of the abdomen. Remember, the foregut is a portion of the gut tube that becomes the stomach and the duodenum. Then when the liver buds from the foregut, it develops within this ventral mesentery anterior to the gut tube, which effectively divides the ventral mesentery into 2 portions. The part of the ventral mesentery running between the liver and the anterior abdominal wall and the diaphragm becomes the falciform ligament, which is a structure you may recall from the solid anatomy video on the anterior abdominal wall. The umbilical vein and the paraumbilical veins run within this falciform ligament, and then remember that the umbilical vein eventually becomes the ligamentum teres in the adult. The digestive tract rotates as it develops, and this significantly rearranges the abdominal viscera. As the stomach rotates clockwise, its dorsal mesentery forms to form a quadruple layer of peritoneum, which we call the greater omentum. And this hangs from the inferior border of the stomach, which we call the greater curvature of the stomach. This greater omentum is found in the coronal plane between the anterior abdominal wall and the intestines, sort of this way. The posterior layer of the greater omentum fuses to the transverse colon, which we'll get to in a moment. The part of the ventral mesentery connecting the stomach and the duodenum to the liver becomes the lesser omentum, which is a double layer of peritoneum that's also in the coronal plane. The area posterior to the stomach and the lesser omentum is called the lesser sac, or the omental bursa. And the rest of the peritoneal cavity is the greater sac. So the greater sac and the lesser sac communicate through an opening posterior to the right side of the stomach, which is called the omental foramen. Before the gut rotates, the liver, the stomach, and the spleen are lined up from anterior to posterior within the mesentery in a sagittal plane. Then after rotation, these 3 organs are lined up in a coronal plane with the liver on the right, the stomach in the middle, and the spleen on the left. The rotation of the stomach also causes the pancreas and the duodenum, which are within that dorsal mesentery, to swing around until they and their mesenteries are laid flat against the posterior wall of the peritoneal cavity. The pancreas and the part of the duodenum and their mesenteries fuse to the parietal peritoneum, which makes these organs secondarily retroperitoneal. You may see them referred to as secondary retroperitoneal structures or secondarily retroperitoneal structures. This classification is different from primarily retroperitoneal organs like the kidneys, which were never intraperitoneal. So the primary or primarily retroperitoneal organs develop outside of the peritoneum. They never have mesenteries, and they're covered only on one side by the peritoneum. We're going to cover these retroperitoneal structures like the adrenal glands and the inferior vena cava in the video on the posterior abdominal wall. So that was all foregut. The stomach, the duodenum, the liver, the pancreas all come from the foregut. Now let's talk about the middle portion of the gut tube, or the midgut. So the midgut elongates much faster than the body of the embryo does. And as it elongates, it forms a loop called a primary loop, which becomes too large to be housed by the peritoneal cavity of the embryo, and it actually has to enter the umbilical cord anteriorly. The superior part of this loop, or the cranial limb, eventually develops into most of the small intestine, while the caudal limb develops into the rest of the small intestine and most of the large intestine, or colon. Now, while within the umbilical cord, the primary loop of the midgut rotates about 90 degrees. And when the abdominal cavity of the embryo has eventually gotten big enough to accommodate the entire GI tract, the primary loop leaves the umbilical cord and returns to the embryo's body, rotating another 180 degrees as it does so. When the midgut's back in place, the colon is arranged around the periphery of a highly coiled small intestine. The small intestine consists of the jejunum and the ileum. The vertically oriented part of the colon on the right side of the peritoneal cavity is called the ascending colon. And then there's a transverse or a horizontal portion called the transverse colon, and then another vertical part on the left side called the descending colon. Now the ascending and descending colon fuse to the posterior abdominal wall, and therefore they become secondarily retroperitoneal, while the transverse colon and the small intestine remain intraperitoneal. Still with me? Now, the peritoneum is basically identical to the serous membrane that lines the pericardium and the pleural sacs. It's just named differently because its location in the body. So you can remember that the inferior border of the abdomen is the pelvic brim, and there's no muscle or membrane or diaphragm that goes across the pelvic brim, so the abdominal cavity is continuous with the pelvic cavity. Thus the peritoneum sags below the pelvic brim and drapes over the pelvic viscera. The peritoneum lining the inner surfaces of the abdominal walls, the inferior surface of the diaphragm, and the superior surfaces of the pelvic viscera is called the parietal peritoneum. And then the peritoneum covering the intraperitoneal organs is called the visceral peritoneum. The parietal peritoneum is continuous with the visceral peritoneum along the mesenteries of the intraperitoneal organs. The mesenteries are sometimes named according to the structure they envelop. So, the mesentery to the transverse colon is called the transverse mesocolon. Serous membranes like the peritoneum consist of a single layer of simple epithelial cells that are supported by a layer of loose connective tissue. Now, these epithelial cells produce fluid that coats the surface of the membrane. You may recall in the pericardial sac we call that fluid pericardial fluid. In the pleural sac we call it pleural fluid. So you can probably guess that in the abdominal cavity, the fluid that's exuded by the peritoneum is called, wait for it, peritoneal fluid. Now the function of the peritoneal fluid is to reduce friction between the abdominal organs, allowing them to sort of slide easily against each other and slide against the abdominal wall as the body changes position, and also as the gut moves during peristalsis. So peritoneal fluid is like WD-40 for your abdominal organs. Okay, you get the picture. Hopefully all that embryology is going to lay some groundwork for understanding the abdominal organs. So let's go ahead and get started with Dr. Phelan to discuss the digestive tract.
The gastrointestinal tract, or digestive tract, or alimentary canal, conveys masticated food from the pharynx, exposes it to enzymes and acids that break it into nutritional components, absorbs these components to transport them into the bloodstream for nourishment of the tissues of the body, and expels the remains out of the body as feces. The gastrointestinal tract has 4 tunics or layers. The outermost layer is the serosa, which in the abdominal cavity is, of course, the peritoneum that forms the mesenteries, connecting the mobile intraperitoneal parts of the tract to the posterior abdominal wall. Deep to the serosa are 2 layers of smooth muscle. a longitudinal layer, and a deeper circular layer. These muscles are responsible for the involuntary, rhythmic, peristaltic contractions that drive ingested material through the digestive tract. Deep to the muscles is a submucosal layer containing blood and lymphatic vessels, nerves, and, in some regions of the tract, mucosal glands. Lining the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract is the mucosal layer, which is composed of epithelial cells specialized according to the function of each of the regions of the digestive tract. The gastrointestinal tract officially begins at the proximal end of the esophagus, which is found in the neck at about the level of the body of the sixth cervical vertebra, posterior to the proximal end of the trachea. The muscular layer of the esophagus begins at the inferior border of the inferior part of the inferior pharyngeal constrictor muscle, which is sometimes called the cricopharyngeus. The inferior constrictor has just one layer of muscle, but the esophagus, like most of the digestive tract, has an inner circular and an outer longitudinal layer of muscle. The superior one-third of the esophageal musculature is striated and under voluntary control via the recurrent laryngeal nerve. The distal third is involuntary, smooth muscle, innervated by the esophageal plexus, and the middle third is a mixture of smooth and striated muscle. The esophagus passes into the thorax through the superior thoracic aperture, anterior to the body of the first thoracic vertebra, and runs through the superior and posterior mediastinum, where the vagus nerves form the esophageal plexus around it. The esophagus finally enters the abdomen through the esophageal hiatus of the diaphragm, with the associated anterior and posterior vagal trunks, at the level of the 10th thoracic vertebra. The abdominal portion of the esophagus is rather short, terminating at the level of the 11th thoracic vertebra posteriorly, and the xiphoid process anteriorly, where it is continuous with the cardiac portion of the stomach. At the level of the esophageal hiatus, the mucosal lining of the esophagus abruptly changes composition from squamous to columnar epithelial cells, usually resulting in a so-called Z-line that may be observed endoscopically. Superior to the Z-line, the mucosa appears whitish pink, while inferior to it, the mucosa is reddish. Squamous epithelium is more resistant to abrasion from sharp foods such as potato chips than is the columnar epithelium of the distal esophagus, by which point previously sharp abrasive food would normally be converted into a softened bolus lubricated by mucus excreted by mucosal glands in the submucosal layer of the esophagus. No absorption occurs in the esophagus. The stomach is an expanded portion of the gastrointestinal tract specialized for the accumulation, liquefaction, and enzymatic digestion of ingested food. It normally occupies the epigastric, left hypochondriac, and umbilical regions. The stomach has four parts: the cardia, which is the part surrounding the gastroesophageal orifice; the fundus, which is the dilated superior part between the gastroesophageal orifice and the left side of the diaphragm; the body, which is between the fundus and the pyloric antrum; and the pyloric part, the funnel-shaped distal area that begins at the pyloric antrum and ends at the pylorus. The pylorus is the area surrounding the pyloric sphincter, the thickening of the circular layer of the stomach muscle that opens and closes the pyloric orifice between the stomach and the duodenum. The stomach has a lesser curvature on its superior aspect, from which extends the lesser omentum, and a greater curvature on its inferior aspect, from which extends the greater omentum. The posterior surface of the stomach forms most of the anterior wall of the lesser sac. The mucosa and submucosa of the stomach are extensively folded into rugae that disappear when the stomach becomes full and distended, which stretches the mucosa and submucosa flat. The gastric mucosa is composed of 4 types of secretory columnar epithelial cells. Mucus cells that secrete alkaline mucus to protect the inner lining of the stomach from self-digestion by acid and from damage by its grinding muscular actions. Parietal cells that secrete hydrochloric acid. Chief cells that secrete the proteolytic enzyme pepsin. And G cells that secrete the hormone gastrin, which stimulates contraction of the gastric muscles and secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsin by the other mucosal cells. While certain lipid-soluble compounds can be taken up by the stomach, very little absorption occurs here. The stomach has a 3rd layer of muscle deep to the circular layer with obliquely oriented fibers. The contractions of the stomach mix food entering through the gastroesophageal orifice with acids and enzymes secreted by the gastric mucosa, ultimately producing a liquefied mixture called chyme. Relaxation of the pyloric sphincter simultaneous with contraction of muscles in the antral region causes chyme to leave the stomach and enter the duodenum. The duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum are the 3 parts of the small intestine, the portion of the gastrointestinal tract primarily involved in absorption of nutrients from food. The duodenum, which is short for duodenum digitorum, is named for the Latin estimation of its length, which is 12 fingers breadth. It is a C-shaped segment of the alimentary canal between the pyloric sphincter and the duodeno-jejunal juncture. It surrounds the head of the pancreas, which will be described shortly. The duodenum is described as having 4 parts. The first part, which may be called the superior part, the ampulla, or the duodenal cap, is short and is found at the level of the body of the first lumbar vertebra. Its proximal portion is the only part of the duodenum that has a mesentery. The remainder of the duodenum is secondarily retroperitoneal. It is attached to the liver by the hepatoduodenal ligament, which is the lateral portion of the lesser omentum through which runs the hepatic portal triad. The second part, or descending part, of the duodenum is located to the right of the level of the bodies of the 1st through 3rd lumbar vertebrae. The pancreatic and bile ducts, which will be described shortly, open into its posteromedial wall. The 3rd, or horizontal part of the duodenum is at the level of the body of the 3rd lumbar vertebra and crosses the right psoas major, the inferior vena cava, and the aorta. The 4th, or ascending portion of the duodenum, runs superiorly along the left side of the aorta. Upon reaching the inferior border of the pancreas, it turns anteriorly to join the jejunum at the duodeno-jejunal junction.
Welcome back. Let's take a break here for a second and discuss a couple of diseases that are related to the anatomy that we've been discussing. In particular, the first disease we're going to discuss is peptic ulcers. Peptic ulcers is where you have a break in the innermost mucosal layer of the stomach or the duodenum that extends into the muscular layer. So the acidity of the stomach contents causes these ulcers to persist and not resolve. Now, 2 common causes for peptic ulcers are the bacterium Helicobacter pylori and also non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs, things like ibuprofen or naproxen. There are certain anatomical sites that you should be aware of where peptic ulcers most often occur. They occur most commonly in the lesser curvature of the stomach and also the first part of the duodenum, so be sure you know that. And then a second clinical entity related to the stomach and the duodenum is something called pyloric stenosis. Now, pyloric stenosis also goes by a little bit more descriptive name, infantile hypertrophic pyloric stenosis, because it occurs in infants. Now, the cause of pyloric stenosis is not entirely understood, but what happens basically is the pyloric sphincter opening into the duodenum becomes hypertrophied, and it creates an obstruction in the GI tract. This obstruction prevents gastric contents from passing out of the stomach into the duodenum. So pyloric stenosis presents with an infant, normally somewhere around 3 to 6 weeks old, who has non-bilious vomiting after feeding. So there's no bile in the vomit because the gastric contents are obstructed at the pylorus, proximal to the site where bile actually enters the GI tract in the duodenum. Now, to treat pyloric stenosis, you have to do surgery and open up that pyloric sphincter in order for the obstruction to be resolved. All right, let's pick things back up with Dr. Phelan.
There is a connection between the diaphragm and the ascending portion of the duodenum that was first described in 1853 by Austrian physician Wendell Treitz. The so-called ligament of Treitz consists of two parts: a suspensory ligament of the duodenum that connects the fourth part of the duodenum to the connective tissue surrounding the celiac trunk, and a slip of the diaphragm muscle that Treitz called the Hilf's muscle, which descends to insert into that same connective tissue around the celiac trunk. The significance of the ligament of Treitz is a matter of controversy. Some claims have been made that this structure provides suspensory support to the gastrointestinal tract, and that its contraction straightens the gastrointestinal tract to facilitate movement of contents through it. Other investigators note that one or both parts of the ligament are often reduced or absent, and argue that it is a relatively insignificant structure. The submucosa of the duodenum contains Brunner's glands that secrete alkaline mucus onto the mucosal lining to protect it from the acidity of the chyme entering from the stomach. Glands are absent from the submucosa of the remainder of the small intestine. The submucosa and mucosa of all parts of the duodenum, except for the first part, are folded to form plicae circulares, transverse folds that extend across 1/2 to 1/3 of the circumference of the duodenal lumen. In other words, the folds form arcs, not circles. The plicae increase the surface area of the mucosa, which increases its absorptive capability. The absorptive area is also increased by projections of the mucosa into the lumen called the villi, which are covered with epithelial cells that have microvilli on their surfaces. The predominant cell type in the duodenal mucosa is the enterocyte, or absorptive cell. Also present are endocrine cells that produce cholecystokinin, which triggers the release of bile and pancreatic enzymes into the duodenum. This process will be discussed in further detail in a moment. The remainder of the small intestine is intraperitoneal. The proximal 40% of it is jejunum, and the distal 60% is ileum. The jejunum is found in the left lumbar and inguinal regions and in the left half of the umbilical region, while the ileum occupies the right lumbar and inguinal regions and the right half of the umbilical and hypogastric regions. The inferior loops of the small intestine hang through the superior pelvic aperture into the lesser pelvis. There is no clear line of demarcation between the two parts, just a long transition zone where the set of characteristics representative of the jejunum fade as the set of characteristics representative of the ileum develop. Some of the distinguishing features of the jejunum and the ileum appear to be related to differences in their functions, while others are a bit of a mystery. The majority of sugars, amino acids, lipids, electrolytes, and water are absorbed in the jejunum and in the proximal ileum, whereas bile acids and vitamin B12 are absorbed in the terminal ileum. The jejunum has a higher concentration of plicae circulares than the duodenum or the ileum, giving it a larger surface area for absorption. and it is more vascularized than the ileum, perhaps in support of its greater absorptive activity. Other differences between the jejunum and the ileum include color. The jejunum is red, the ileum is a pale pink. Weight. The jejunum is heavier and thicker. Mesenteric fat. The jejunal mesentery has less. And structure of its blood supply. The jejunum has larger loops in its arterial arcades and longer vasa recta, the vessels extending to the intestine from the arcades. One particularly distinguishing feature of the ileum is that it has abundant lymphoid nodules called Peyer's patches in its submucosa, which are scarce in the jejunum. Antigens in the digested material passing through the ileum trigger immune responses modulated by lymphocytes in the Peyer's patches. The lumen of the ileum becomes continuous with that of the large intestine at the ileocecal junction. At the level of this junction, the circular muscular layer of the ileum thickens to form a sphincter called the ileocecal valve, which is thought to control the flow of digested material from the ileum to the large intestine. The same hormone that relaxes the pyloric sphincter, gastrin, also relaxes the ileocecal valve.
So that covers one of our 3 videos on the abdominal organs. So now I want you to pause your video, answer the end of session quiz questions, and then we're going to go through those answers together. All right, let's get going. First question, what connects the ileum to the large intestine? That's the ileocolic sphincter. Next, what's the name of the folds of mucosa of the stomach? Those are called the rugae. Next, what's the ligament connecting the liver to the anterior abdominal wall? That's the falciform ligament. Next, what parts of the colon are retroperitoneal? Remember we said it was the ascending and the descending colon, and then the transverse colon is intraperitoneal. Next, which part of the GI tract contains Peyer's patches? That's the ileum. And the last part is your mock practical. So we have some images for you to label, and I want you to practice labeling these in a timed setting, and we'll be all finished. Thanks.